The sun hung low and cruel over the town of Coldwater Junction, casting long shadows across the dusty main street like the fingers of judgment itself. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and where that business was discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors and over whiskey-stained bar tops. The wooden buildings leaned slightly, as if weary from bearing witness to too many broken dreams and buried secrets. And on this particular evening, the biggest secret being whispered about was no secret at all. Arden Cole was going to lose everything. She stood on the porch of the general store, her hands gripping a short list of supplies she could barely afford, watching the sun bleed orange across the horizon. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her clothes, work-worn trousers, a faded cotton shirt, and boots that had seen better years, marked her as different, improper, unwomanly. At least that's what the town had decided. Inside the store, she could hear the murmur of voices. Mrs. Halloway, the baker's wife, and Mr. Jessup, who owned the feed store. They weren't trying to be quiet. "It's a shame, really," Mrs. Halloway said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "A young woman like that, trying to run a ranch all alone. It's unnatural." "Unnatural and foolish," Jessup agreed. "Her father should have sold that land years ago. Now she's sitting on a pile of debt with no way to pay it. Mark my words, by month's end, the bank will take it all." Arden's jaw tightened. She pushed open the door, and the conversation stopped like a candle snuffed out. Both of them turned to look at her, their expression shifting from gossip to pity in an instant. "Miss Cole," Mrs. Halloway said, her smile strained. "We were just—" "I know what you were just," Arden said coolly. She handed her list to the shopkeeper, Mr. Brennan, who took it without meeting her eyes. "I'll take what I can afford." Brennan scanned the list, his lips pursing. "That'll be $18, Miss Cole." Arden pulled a small leather pouch from her coat and counted out the coins slowly. $17.40. She looked up at Brennan. "I'm short. Can I owe you the rest until—" "No credit," Brennan said flatly. "Store policy." "Since when?" Arden's voice was sharp now. "Since the bank made it clear who's a risk and who isn't," Brennan replied, his tone apologetic but firm. "I've got my own debts to worry about, Miss Cole." Mrs. Halloway made a small sound of sympathy, but Arden didn't look at her. She stared at Brennan for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Fine. Take off the coffee and the sugar." Brennan did as he was told, and Arden gathered her reduced supplies in silence. As she turned to leave, Jessup spoke up. "You could always sell, you know," he said, his tone fatherly and condescending all at once. "There are men in town who'd give you a fair price. You could start fresh somewhere else. Maybe find a husband, settle down proper-like." Arden stopped in the doorway. She turned, and the look she gave Jessup could have frozen the summer heat itself. "If any man in this town thinks he can take what's mine," she said quietly, "he's welcome to try." She walked out before anyone could respond. But the ride back to the ranch was long and lonely. The road wound through dry grasslands and rocky outcroppings, the kind of terrain that tested both horse and rider. Arden's mare, a sturdy sorrel named Rust, knew the way by heart. They moved in silence, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth. Arden's mind churned. The ranch, her father's ranch, now hers, was failing. Not because she was incapable, not because she didn't work hard enough. She worked harder than any man in Coldwater Junction, up before dawn and collapsing into bed long after dark. But hard work didn't pay off debts. Hard work didn't fix a broken fence line or replace a barn roof that leaked every time it rained. Hard work didn't stop the bank from demanding payment on a loan her father had taken out 2 years before he died. A loan she hadn't even known about until the letter came. Due in full by the end of the month. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure. She had 4 weeks. 4 weeks to come up with $3,000, a sum that might as well have been the moon. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped below the hills. It wasn't much to look at. A small house with a sagging porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a cluster of corrals and outbuildings that had seen better days. But it was hers. It was all she had left of her father, of her family, of the life she'd fought so hard to hold on to. and she'd be damned if she let anyone take it from her. But the next morning, Arden woke to the sound of something breaking. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed the rifle from beside her bed. Barefoot and still in her nightshirt, she moved quickly to the window and peered out. One of the corral gates had come loose and was banging in the wind. 3 of her horses had gotten out and were wandering toward the road. "Damn it," she muttered, setting the rifle down and pulling on her boots. She didn't bother changing. There was no time. By the time she got outside, the horses were halfway to the road, and the sun was barely cresting the horizon. She grabbed a rope and started after them, calling out in the low, calm voice her father had taught her to use with spooked animals. "Easy now, easy." It took her 20 minutes to round them up and get them back into the corral. By the time she'd fixed the gate, a temporary fix at best, using rope and a bent nail, she was sweating and furious. This was the 4th thing to break this week. The 4th thing she didn't have money to replace. She was still standing there, staring at the gate, when she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Arden turned, shading her eyes against the rising sun. A rider was coming up the road. A man on a tall black horse moving at an easy, unhurried pace. He was a stranger. She could tell that much even from a distance. Strangers didn't come to her ranch. She walked toward the house, keeping one eye on the rider, and grabbed the rifle from just inside the door. She didn't aim it at him, yet, but she held it in a way that made it clear she could. The man pulled up at the edge of her property and dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and a face that looked like it had seen its share of trouble. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he wore a gun on his hip, but his hand stayed well clear of it. "Morning," he said, his voice low and easy. "Morning," Arden replied, her tone flat. "You lost?" "No, ma'am." He tipped his hat, a worn Stetson that had seen better days. "Name's Rhett Maddox. I heard in town you might be looking for help." Arden blinked. "You heard wrong." "Did I?" Rhett glanced around the ranch, his gaze taking in the broken gate, the leaning barn, the overgrown weeds creeping up the side of the house. "Seems like you could use an extra pair of hands." "I don't have money to pay you," Arden said bluntly. "Didn't ask for money." She frowned. "Then what do you want?" Rhett met her eyes, and for a moment she felt like he could see straight through her. Not in a threatening way, just in a way that made her feel seen, understood. It was unsettling. "I want work," he said simply. "Food, a place to sleep, and honest work. That's all." "Why here?" Arden asked. "There are a dozen ranches between here and the next town. Why mine?" Rhett shrugged. "Because they told me not to." Arden's eyes narrowed. "Who did?" "Just about everyone I talked to in Coldwater Junction," Rhett said with a faint smile. "Said you were wild, unfit, that working for you would be a waste of time." He paused. "Figured anyone the town hates that much must be worth meeting." Despite herself, Arden felt a flicker of something, amusement maybe, or respect. She lowered the rifle slightly. "You don't know me," she said. "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know when someone's getting a raw deal, and I know when a place needs help." He gestured toward the barn. "That roof's going to cave in come winter if you don't fix it, and that fence line—" He nodded toward the western pasture. "It's down in 3 places. Coyotes will pick off your calves if you don't get it mended." Arden stared at him. He was right about all of it. "I don't need your pity," she said quietly. "Good," Rhett replied, "because I'm not offering any." They stood there for a long moment, the wind picking up and stirring the dust between them. Finally, Arden sighed. "Barn's got a loft," she said. "You can sleep there. Meals are at dawn and dusk. You work, you eat. You slack off, you leave. Understood?" Rhett's smile widened just a fraction. "Yes, ma'am." "And stop calling me ma'am," Arden added. "Makes me feel old. Name's Arden." "Arden," Rhett repeated, as if testing the sound of it. He nodded. "All right, then. Where do you want me to start?" "Not set." For the first 3 days, Arden half expected Rhett to disappear. Men like him, drifters, wanderers, they didn't stick around. They took what they could get and moved on. But Rhett stayed. And he worked. He worked like a man who knew what he was doing, which was a surprise in itself. He fixed the barn roof, replacing the rotted boards with wood he scavenged from an old shed at the back of the property. He mended the fence line, driving new posts into the hard ground with a strength and precision that left Arden quietly impressed. He even fixed the corral gate properly, using nails and hinges he'd somehow acquired in town. Arden didn't ask where he'd gotten them. She didn't want to know. They worked side by side most days, and Rhett was a man of few words. He didn't pry, didn't ask questions, didn't try to tell her how to run her own ranch, which was a refreshing change from every other man she'd ever dealt with. But he watched. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt curious, like he was trying to figure her out. On the fourth day, they were moving cattle from the east pasture to the north when one of the calves bolted. It was a young steer, barely 6 months old, and it took off toward the river with the kind of single-minded panic that only young animals possess. "I'll get him," Arden said, spurring Rust forward. "Wait," Rhett started, but she was already gone. The steer plunged into the river, and Arden followed without hesitation. The water was shallow but fast, the current tugging at Rust's legs. The steer was struggling, its eyes rolling white with fear, and Arden urged Rust closer, leaning down to grab the rope she'd looped around the steer's neck earlier. She got a hand on it, and then Rust stumbled. The mare's front leg hit a submerged rock, and she went down hard, pitching Arden forward. Arden hit the water with a gasp, the cold stealing her breath, and for a moment everything was chaos. Water, rocks, the steer thrashing beside her. Then a strong hand grabbed her arm and hauled her upright. Rhett was in the water beside her, his grip firm and steady. "You all right?" Arden coughed, water streaming down her face. "I'm fine." "You sure?" His eyes scanned her quickly, checking for injuries. "I said I'm fine," Arden snapped, pulling her arm free. She grabbed Rust's reins and the mare struggled to her feet, shaking water everywhere. The steer, meanwhile, had made it to the far bank and was standing there looking confused. Rhett waded after it, calm as anything, and led it back to solid ground. By the time Arden got Rust out of the river, Rhett had the steer settled and was waiting for her. "That was reckless," he said quietly. "That was my job," Arden shot back. "I don't need you to—" "I'm not saying you can't do it," Rhett interrupted. His voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I'm saying you don't have to do it alone." Arden opened her mouth to argue, and then stopped. Because he was right. She'd been doing everything alone for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone at her back. "Fine," she said finally. "Next time we go together." Rhett nodded. Next time. But word spread quickly in Coldwater Junction that Arden Cole had hired help. And not just any help, a drifter. A man with no name, no history, no ties to anyone in town. The whispers grew louder. "She's desperate," Mrs. Halloway said, shaking her head over her morning bread dough. "She's foolish," Jessup added, leaning against the counter of the feed store. "Mark my words, that man will rob her blind and leave her worse off than before." But the loudest voice of all belonged to Clayton Dorsey. Dorsey was the wealthiest man in Coldwater Junction, the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, and the man who held the mortgage on Arden's land. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And he did not like being defied. He rode out to Arden's ranch on the 5th day, accompanied by 2 of his men. Arden saw them coming from the porch, where she was mending a saddle, and her stomach sank. "Stay inside," she told Rhett, who had been working nearby. "Why?" Rhett asked, his eyes on the approaching riders. "Because I said so." Rhett didn't move. "Who is that?" "Clayton Dorsey," Arden said quietly. "The man who owns my debt." Rhett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He stepped up beside her, his hand resting casually on the porch railing. "Then I'm staying." Arden wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. Dorsey pulled up in front of the house, dismounting with the ease of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. His men stayed mounted, their hands close to their guns. "Miss Cole," Dorsey said, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth, friendly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Arden said flatly. "What do you want, Mr. Dorsey?" Dorsey smiled. "Just checking in, making sure you're managing." "I'm managing fine." "Are you?"
Dorsey's gaze flicked to Rhett, then back to Arden. I heard you hired some help. That's good. Smart.
But I have to wonder, can you afford it? My finances are none of your concern, Arden said. Oh, but they are, Dorsey replied, his smile widening. You see, I hold the note on this property, which means I have a vested interest in making sure it's being properly maintained. He paused. And from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like it is. Arden's hands clenched into fists. I've got 3 weeks left to pay. I'll have your money. Will you? Dorsey's tone was skeptical. Because I've been doing some calculations, Miss Cole, and I don't see how. Your herd is small. Your ranch is falling apart. And you're hemorrhaging money on repairs. He gestured toward the barn. Respectfully, I think it's time to face facts. You can't do this alone. She's not alone, Rhett said quietly. Dorsey's eyes shifted to him, and for the first time there was something cold in his gaze. And who are you? Rhett Maddox, Rhett said evenly. I work here. Do you now? Dorsey's smile returned, but it was sharper now. Well, Mr. Maddox, I hope Miss Cole is paying you well, because come month's end there won't be a ranch left to work on. We'll see, Rhett said. The two men stared at each other, and the air between them crackled with tension. Arden stepped forward, breaking the moment. If that's all, Mr. Dorsey, I have work to do, she said. Dorsey turned back to her, and his expression softened into something almost pitying. Miss Cole, I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help you. If you sell to me now, I'll give you a fair price. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. You could have a real life, one that doesn't involve breaking your back on a dying ranch. This ranch isn't dying, Arden said, and I'm not selling. Dorsey sighed, shaking his head. I hope you don't regret that decision. He mounted his horse, his men following suit. 3 weeks, Miss Cole. After that, the decision won't be yours to make. He rode off, and Arden watched him go, her heart pounding. You all right? Rhett asked quietly. No, Arden said, but I will be. That night, Arden sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low beside her, and stared at the numbers in her father's old ledger. No matter how many times she added them up, the answer was the same. She was short. By a lot. The door creaked open, and Rhett stepped inside, a cup of coffee in hand. He set it down in front of her without a word. Thanks, Arden said quietly. Rhett pulled out a chair and sat across from her. What's the plan? I don't have one, Arden admitted. Not yet. You will, Rhett said. You're too stubborn not to. Arden looked up at him, and despite everything, she smiled. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's a fact, Rhett replied. His eyes were serious now. You're a fighter, Arden. Anyone can see that. But you can't fight a bank with just grit. Then what do I fight them with? Arden asked. Rhett leaned back in his chair, thinking. You need leverage. Something they want more than they want this land. Like what? Money, Rhett said simply. You need to make enough in the next 3 weeks to pay off that debt and prove to Dorsey and everyone else that you're not going anywhere. Arden laughed bitterly. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? My herd's too small to sell, and even if I sold every head, it wouldn't be enough. Then you don't sell here, Rhett said. You drive them somewhere else, somewhere the price is better. Arden stared at him. You're talking about the railhead at Silver Creek. I am. Silver Creek was over 100 miles away, through some of the roughest terrain in the territory. The drive would take at least 2 weeks, maybe more, and there was no guarantee they'd make it. Storms, stampedes, predators, any one of those could wipe them out. It's a hell of a gamble, Arden said. It is, Rhett agreed, but it's the only one you've got. Arden looked down at the ledger, then back at Rhett, and slowly she nodded. All right, she said, let's do it. The next morning, Arden and Rhett began preparations. They rounded up every head of cattle on the ranch, 63 in total, a mix of steers, cows, and calves. It wasn't a large herd, but it was all they had. They would need help. 2 people couldn't drive 63 head of cattle over 100 miles alone. Arden knew that. But finding help in Coldwater Junction was going to be damn near impossible. She tried anyway. She went to the saloon first, where the ranch hands and drifters gathered. The room fell silent when she walked in, every eye turning to her. "I need 2 men," Arden said, her voice cutting through the quiet. 2 weeks' work. Cattle drive to Silver Creek. I'll pay when we get back." "And if you don't get back," someone called out, "then you'll have wasted 2 weeks," Arden shot back. "But if we do, you'll have more money in your pocket than you'd make in a month here." No one moved. "What's the matter?" Arden said, her voice sharp now. "None of you man enough to work for a woman?" A few of the men shifted uncomfortably, but still no one spoke. Then a voice from the back said, "I'll do it." Arden turned. A young man, barely 20, with sandy hair and a nervous smile, stood up. "Name's Danny Fletcher. I've done drives before. I can help." Arden studied him. He looked green, but there was something earnest in his face. "You sure about this?" "Yes, ma'am," Danny said. "All right," Arden said. "You're hired. Anyone else?" Silence. Arden gritted her teeth and walked out. "What?" In the end, it was just the 3 of them, Arden, Rhett, and Danny. 3 people to drive 63 head of cattle across 100 miles of unforgiving land. It was madness, but it was all they had. They left at dawn 3 days later, the cattle strung out in a long line, moving slow and steady. Arden rode point, Rhett took the rear, and Danny worked the flanks, keeping the stragglers in line. The first 2 days were hard but manageable. The weather held, the cattle cooperated, and they made good time. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear, the next, it was black with clouds, and the wind was howling like a living thing. The cattle started to panic, their eyes rolling, their bodies pressing together. "Keep them moving," Arden shouted over the wind. "Don't let them bunch up." But it was too late. Thunder cracked overhead, and the herd bolted. It was chaos. 63 head of cattle running blind, scattering in every direction. Arden spurred Rust forward, trying to turn the leaders, trying to keep them from running off a cliff or into a ravine. Beside her, Rhett was doing the same, his voice calm and steady even as the rain poured down in sheets. And then Arden saw it. A calf, separated from the herd, running straight toward a rocky outcrop. She didn't think. She just moved. Rust surged forward, hooves pounding, and Arden leaned low in the saddle, reaching out. Her hand closed around the calf's rope, and she pulled hard, turning it just before it would have crashed into the rocks. But the effort threw her off balance. Rust stumbled, and Arden went flying. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of her lungs, and for a moment, everything went black. When she came to, Rhett was kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "Arden," he was saying, his voice urgent. "Arden, can you hear me?" "I'm fine," she gasped, pushing herself upright. "The herd—" "Danny's got them," Rhett said. "They're settling down. You need to rest." "I don't have time to rest," Arden snapped, getting to her feet. She swayed and Rhett caught her. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're no good to anyone if you kill yourself." Arden wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Her head was spinning, her body aching. She let Rhett help her back to Rust, and together they rode back to the herd. They lost 4 head in the storm. 4 cattle that wandered off in the chaos and couldn't be found. It was a blow, but not a fatal one. They kept moving. The days blurred together after that. Heat, dust, exhaustion. The terrain grew rougher, the days longer, but slowly, steadily, they made progress. And through it all, Arden felt something shifting inside her, a bond forming with the 2 men beside her. Rhett, who never complained and never wavered. Danny, who worked himself to the bone and never asked for more than he was given. They were a team, a family, almost. And as the railhead at Silver Creek finally came into view on the horizon, Arden allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to hope. They had made it. Now came the hard part. The railhead at Silver Creek wasn't much to look at. A cluster of wooden buildings, a series of loading pens, and the gleaming iron rails that stretched east toward civilization and money. But to Arden, riding in with 59 head of cattle after 2 weeks of hell, it looked like salvation. They arrived just after noon, the sun beating down mercilessly. The cattle were tired, their ribs showing through dusty hides, but they were alive. Arden was exhausted, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, but she sat tall in the saddle as they rode down the main street. People stared. A woman leading a cattle drive wasn't something you saw every day, especially not out here. Rhett rode up beside her, his hat pulled low against the sun. "Where do we take them?" "The holding pens," Arden said, nodding toward a fenced area near the rail station. "We'll get them settled, then find the cattle broker." Danny brought up the rear, looking half dead but grinning. The kid had proven himself a dozen times over on the trail. He'd worked harder than men twice his age and never once complained. They guided the herd into the pens and Arden dismounted, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. Rhett was there in an instant, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I will be," Arden said, pulling away gently. "Once this is done." She left Rhett and Danny to watch the cattle and walked toward the main building, a long, low structure with a sign that read Silver Creek Livestock Exchange. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey. Men in suits sat at tables, conducting business in low voices, their eyes calculating and cold. Arden walked up to the clerk at the front desk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I need to see the broker," Arden said. "Mr. Cantwell is busy," the clerk replied, not looking up from his ledger. "Then I'll wait." The clerk sighed. "Name?" "Arden Cole. I've got 59 head outside, prime beef. I'm looking to sell." That got his attention. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You bring them in yourself?" "I did." The clerk's lips twitched, though whether in amusement or disbelief, Arden couldn't tell. "Wait here." He disappeared through a door at the back, and Arden stood there, feeling every eye in the room on her. She kept her back straight, her expression calm, even though her heart was pounding. A few minutes later, the clerk returned with a man in tow. Mr. Cantwell was in his 40s, well-fed, with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He extended a hand to Arden. "Miss Cole, is it?" His handshake was firm. "I'm told you've got cattle to sell." "I do," Arden said. 59 head. Good stock. I'm looking for top dollar." Cantwell's smile was polite but non-committal. "Let's take a look, shall we?" They walked outside together, and Cantwell spent the next 20 minutes inspecting the herd. He moved among them with practiced ease, checking their teeth, running his hands over their flanks, making notes in a small book he carried. Arden watched him, her stomach tight with anxiety. Everything depended on this. Finally, Cantwell closed his book and turned to her. "They're in decent shape," he said, "considering the drive, but they're not prime. I can give you $30 a head." Arden's heart sank. 30? That's robbery. These are worth at least 40. "Maybe in Coldwater Junction," Cantwell said. "But here, the market's flooded. I've got 3 other herds coming in this week. If you don't like my offer, you're welcome to try your luck elsewhere." Arden clenched her jaw. $30 a head would bring in just over $1,700. It wasn't enough. She needed at least $2,500 to cover the debt and have enough left over to keep the ranch running. 35, she said. "And that's my final offer." Cantwell studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. 32, take it or leave it. Arden wanted to scream. She wanted to argue, to fight, to demand what her cattle were worth. But she could see in Cantwell's eyes that he wouldn't budge. He held all the cards, and he knew it. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. 32. Cantwell extended his hand again, and they shook. "Pleasure doing business with you, Miss Cole. I'll have the money ready by tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Arden's eyes widened. "I need it today." "Can't be done," Cantwell said. "The bank's closed. You'll have your money first thing in the morning." Arden wanted to protest, but there was no point. She nodded stiffly. "Tomorrow, then." As Cantwell walked away, Rhett stepped up beside her. "How much?" 32 a head, Arden said quietly. "It's not enough." Rhett didn't say anything, but she could feel the weight of his silence. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "We always do." Arden wasn't so sure. They found a boarding house on the edge of town and paid for 2 rooms, one for Arden, one for Rhett and Danny to share. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed and a wash basin, but after 2 weeks sleeping on the ground, it felt like luxury. Arden washed the dust and sweat from her skin, changed into the one clean shirt she'd packed, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The math kept running through her head, no matter how many times she tried to push it away. 59 head at $32 each came to just over $1,800. The debt was $3,000. Even after selling the cattle, she'd still be $1,200 short. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Arden called. Rhett stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, but his expression was calm. "We need to talk," he said. "I know," Arden replied. "The money's not enough." "No, it's not."
Rhett pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. But there might be another way. Arden looked up, her eyes wary.
"What way?" "There's a poker game tonight," Rhett said. "Big stakes. Some of the cattle brokers, a few ranchers passing through. I heard about it at the saloon." Arden's stomach dropped. "No, absolutely not." "Hear me out." "I said no," Arden interrupted, her voice sharp. "I'm not gambling what little money we have on a card game." "You won't be," Rhett said calmly. "I will." Arden stared at him. "You?" "I'm good at poker," Rhett said. "Better than good. I can win enough to cover what we're short." "Or you could lose everything," Arden shot back, "and then we'd be worse off than we started." "That's true," Rhett admitted. "But what's your alternative? Go back to Coldwater Junction with $1,800 and hope Dorsey takes pity on you?" Arden wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. She didn't have another option. "How much would you need to buy in?" she asked quietly. $200, Rhett said. Arden closed her eyes. $200 was more than a tenth of what they'd made on the cattle. If Rhett lost, it would be gone forever. But if he won... "All right," she said finally, opening her eyes. "But I'm coming with you." Rhett shook his head. "That's not a good idea." "I don't care," Arden said. "If you're risking my money, I'm going to be there to see it." Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded. "Fine. But you stay quiet. Don't distract me, don't question me, and for the love of everything, don't let anyone know you're worried." "I can do that," Arden said. She hoped it was true. The poker game was held in the back room of the largest saloon in Silver Creek. It was a smoke-filled space with a single round table, 5 chairs, and a bartender who doubled as a dealer. The men already seated looked exactly like what Arden expected. Hard-eyed, well-dressed, and wealthy. Rhett walked in like he owned the place, Arden trailing behind him. The other players looked up, their gazes flicking from Rhett to Arden and back again. "Didn't know we were allowing spectators," one of them said. He was older, with a silver mustache and a diamond stick pin in his tie. "She's with me," Rhett said, pulling out a chair. "That a problem?" The man shrugged. "Your funeral." Rhett sat down and placed $200 on the table. The dealer counted it, nodded, and dealt the first hand. Arden found a spot against the wall where she could watch without being in the way. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The first few hands were cautious. Rhett won 1, lost 2, and stayed even. Arden forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her expression neutral. But as the night wore on, the stakes grew higher. Rhett was good, better than good. He read the other players like a book, folding when he needed to, pushing when he had the advantage. Slowly, his pile of chips grew. But so did the tension. By midnight, it was down to 3 players. Rhett, the man with the silver mustache, and a younger man in an expensive suit who'd been drinking steadily all night. The pot was over $1,000. Arden's hands were clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The dealer laid out the final card. Rhett's expression didn't change. He looked at his cards, then at the pot, then at the other 2 players. "I'm all in," he said, pushing his entire stack into the center of the table. The younger man folded immediately, cursing under his breath. But the man with the silver mustache didn't move. He stared at Rhett, his eyes calculating. "You're bluffing," he said finally. Rhett didn't respond. The man with the mustache pushed his chips forward. "Call." The dealer nodded. "Show your cards." Rhett laid down his hand. A full house, kings over 10s. The man with the mustache stared at it for a long moment, then threw his cards down in disgust. Damn! Rhett collected his winnings without a word, his expression calm. Arden wanted to cheer, to run over and hug him, but she stayed rooted to the spot, her face carefully blank. As they left the saloon 20 minutes later, Rhett's pockets heavy with cash, Arden finally let herself breathe. How much? She asked. 1,400, Rhett said quietly. Enough to cover what we need and then some. Arden stopped walking. She turned to look at him, and for the first time in weeks she felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking. Rhett met her gaze, and something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. We're partners, he said simply. Partners take care of each other. They collected the money from Cantwell the next morning and left Silver Creek before noon. The ride back to Coldwater Junction was long, but this time it felt different. The weight of dread that had hung over Arden for weeks was gone, replaced by something lighter. Hope, maybe. Or vindication. They arrived home just after sunset, the ranch looking exactly as they'd left it, shabby, worn, but still standing. Arden dismounted and stood in the yard, staring at the house. She'd done it. Against all odds, against everyone's expectations, she'd done it. We should head into town tomorrow, Rhett said, coming to stand beside her. Pay off the bank. Make it official. Arden nodded. First thing in the morning. But as they stood there, a rider appeared on the road. Arden's stomach tightened as she recognized the horse. Clayton Dorsey. He rode up slowly, his expression unreadable. Miss Cole, he said, tipping his hat. I heard you were back. I am, Arden said, her voice cold. Dorsey dismounted, his eyes flicking to Rhett before returning to Arden. I also heard you drove your cattle all the way to Silver Creek. Quite the gamble. It paid off, Arden said. Did it? Dorsey's smile was thin. I'm glad to hear it, but I'm afraid there's been a complication. Arden's blood ran cold. What kind of complication? Dorsey pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and handed it to her. The bank has decided to call in your loan early, effective immediately. Arden unfolded the paper, her hands shaking. It was a notice signed by the bank president demanding full payment within 3 days. This is illegal, Arden said, her voice shaking with fury. I have 3 weeks left. The contract has a clause, Dorsey said smoothly. In the event of significant risk to the collateral, the bank reserves the right to accelerate payment. Your absence for 2 weeks, leaving the property unattended, constitutes such a risk. That's insane, Rhett said, his voice hard. You can't. I can, Dorsey interrupted. And I have. He turned back to Arden. You have 3 days, Miss Cole. If you can't pay, the property will be seized. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Arden standing there, the notice trembling in her hands. This isn't over, Rhett said quietly. We'll fight this. But as Arden stared at the paper, she felt the hope that had carried her home begin to crumble. The fight was far from over. Arden didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the notice spread out in front of her, reading it over and over until the words blurred together. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the room, and outside the wind howled through the rafters of the barn like a warning. Rhett sat across from her, his arms folded, his eyes dark with anger he was barely containing. Danny had gone to the barn hours ago, exhausted from the journey, but neither Arden nor Rhett could rest. There has to be a way to fight this, Rhett said for the 3rd time. This clause he's using, it's meant for abandoned property, not for someone running their business. Doesn't matter what it's meant for, Arden said quietly. It's what's written. And Dorsey knows the law better than we do. He probably helped write it. Rhett's jaw tightened. Then we get a lawyer. With what money? Arden looked up at him, her eyes hollow. Even if we could afford one, there's no time. 3 days, Rhett. We'd be lucky to even get an appointment. So what, you're just going to give up? Rhett's voice was sharp now, frustration bleeding through. After everything we just did? After dragging those cattle 100 miles through hell and back? I'm not giving up, Arden shot back, her voice rising. I'm being realistic. Dorsey owns the bank. He owns half the town. He's been waiting for this moment since my father died. And now he's got it. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor.
You think I want this? You think I want to lose everything? Then fight, Rhett said, standing to face her. Fight him the way you fought that storm, the way you fought every single person who told you this was impossible. Arden's hands clenched into fists. And what if fighting isn't enough? What if I do everything right and still lose? The question hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Rhett stared at her, and for a moment his expression softened.
Then at least you'll know you didn't quit, he said quietly. And neither will I. Arden's throat tightened. She turned away, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Get some rest, she said, her voice rough. We ride into town at first light. Rhett hesitated, then nodded. All right. But Arden? She looked back at him. We're going to win this, he said, one way or another. Arden wanted to believe him. She just didn't know if she could. They arrived in Coldwater Junction just after dawn, the streets still quiet except for a few early risers sweeping storefronts. Arden rode straight to the bank, her jaw set, the money from the cattle sale heavy in her saddlebag. Rhett and Danny flanked her, silent but present. The bank was a sturdy brick building at the center of town, its windows gleaming in the morning light. Arden dismounted and tied Rust to the hitching post, then walked inside with Rhett at her side. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of ink and old paper. A clerk sat behind a wooden counter, scribbling in a ledger. He looked up as they entered, and his expression shifted from boredom to surprise. Miss Cole, he said, setting down his pen. What brings you in so early? I'm here to pay my debt, Arden said, pulling the saddlebag off her shoulder and dropping it on the counter with a heavy thud. In full. The clerk blinked. I'm sorry, but Mr. Dorsey left instructions that... I don't care what instructions he left, Arden interrupted. The loan is due. I'm paying it. Count it. The clerk's hands trembled slightly as he opened the bag and began counting the bills. Arden stood there, her arms crossed, her heart pounding. Behind her, Rhett's presence was a solid, reassuring weight. After what felt like an eternity, the clerk looked up. It's all here, he said, his voice faint. $3,000. Then mark the loan as paid, Arden said. And give me a receipt. The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the back office where Dorsey usually worked. I should really speak with Mr. Dorsey first. You'll speak with him after you give me my receipt, Arden said, her voice like steel. I've met the terms of the contract. You have no legal grounds to refuse payment. The clerk swallowed hard, then nodded. He pulled out a ledger, made a notation, and wrote out a receipt in shaking handwriting. He stamped it and handed it to Arden. She took it, folding it carefully and tucking it into her coat pocket. Thank you. As she turned to leave, the door to the back office opened and Clayton Dorsey stepped out. He froze when he saw her, his eyes narrowing. Miss Cole, he said smoothly, though there was a flicker of something in his expression, surprise maybe, or anger. I wasn't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't, Arden said coldly. She pulled the receipt from her pocket and held it up. The loan is paid, in full. As of this morning. Dorsey's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went hard. I see. Well, congratulations. He paused. Though I have to say, I'm surprised you managed to come up with the money so quickly. Are you? Arden's voice was sharp. Or are you just disappointed? Dorsey's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Disappointed? Not at all. I'm simply impressed. Though I have to wonder how sustainable this victory is. After all, you've spent everything you had. What happens when the next problem arises? The next drought? The next bad season? I'll deal with it, Arden said, the same way I dealt with you. Dorsey's expression darkened. Careful, Miss Cole. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. Is that a threat? Rhett said quietly, stepping forward. Dorsey turned his gaze to Rhett, and the two men stared at each other for a long, tense moment. Just a word of advice, Dorsey said finally. This town has a long memory, and it doesn't take kindly to those who don't know their place. Good thing I've never cared much about my place, Arden said. She turned and walked out, Rhett and Danny following close behind. Outside, the morning sun was warm on her face, and for the first time in weeks,
Arden allowed herself a small, fierce smile. She'd won. But as they rode out of town, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dorsey's words weren't just a warning, they were a promise.
Hashem. The next few days passed in a blur of work. Arden threw herself into repairing the ranch, fixing everything that had been neglected during the cattle drive. Rhett and Danny worked alongside her, and slowly the place began to look less like a dying dream and more like something worth fighting for. But the town's response was colder than Arden had anticipated. Word of her victory over Dorsey spread quickly, and with it came a shift in the way people treated her. The men who had refused to work for her before still refused, but now their reasons were different. It wasn't that she was a woman, it was that she'd made a powerful enemy, and no one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Arden tried to buy supplies at the general store and found her credit suddenly revoked. She went to the feed store and was told they were out of stock, even though she could see the bags piled in the back. She stopped by the saloon to ask about hiring hands and was met with silence. It was suffocating. They're scared, Rhett said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Dorsey's got them all by the throat, and they know it. Let them be scared, Arden said bitterly. I don't need them. You might, Rhett said quietly, if things get worse. Arden didn't respond. She didn't want to think about things getting worse. But 2 days later, they did. It started with the fence. Arden woke to find an entire section of the western fence line torn down, the posts pulled up and tossed aside like kindling. 20 head of cattle had wandered off during the night, and it took her, Rhett, and Danny most of the day to round them up. This wasn't an accident, Rhett said, crouching beside one of the broken posts. Look at this. Clean cuts. Someone took a saw to it. Arden stared at the damage, her stomach churning. Dorsey. Probably, Rhett agreed, or someone working for him. What do we do? Danny asked, his voice tight with worry. We rebuild, Arden said. Arden, and we watch. From now on, one of us is always on patrol at night. They worked through the evening to fix the fence, but the damage was done. Arden could feel the weight of it settling over her like a shadow. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. This was war. The second attack came 3 days later. Arden was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard Danny shouting. She dropped the pitchfork and ran outside to find smoke rising from the far end of the property. The hay shed was on fire. No, 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 Arden breathed, running toward it. Rhett was already there, hauling buckets of water from the trough, but the flames were too strong, too fast. Get back, Rhett shouted. It's going to collapse. Arden ignored him, grabbing another bucket and throwing water onto the flames. The heat was unbearable, searing her skin, but she couldn't stop. That hay was worth hundreds of dollars, hay she needed to feed the cattle through the winter. The shed groaned, and Rhett grabbed her arm, yanking her back just as the roof caved in with a roar of sparks and ash. Arden stood there, breathing hard, watching everything burn. It was arson, Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. I found this near the back. He held up a half-burned piece of cloth soaked in kerosene. Arden took it, her hands shaking. He's trying to bleed me dry. He's trying to break you, Rhett corrected, and we're not going to let him. Arden looked at him, then at Danny, who stood nearby, his face pale but determined. No, she said quietly. We're not. That night, Arden rode into town alone. Rhett had tried to stop her, arguing that it was too dangerous, but she'd refused to listen. This was her fight, and she was going to face it head on. She found Dorsey at the saloon, sitting at a corner table with 2 of his men, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as she walked in, and his smile was slow and cold. Miss Cole, he said, raising his glass, to what do I owe the pleasure? Arden walked up to his table and slammed her hands down on it, hard enough to make the glasses jump. You're going to stop. Dorsey raised an eyebrow. Stop what? The fence, the fire, whatever you're planning next. Arden's voice was low and deadly. You're going to stop, or I swear to you I will make you regret it. Dorsey leaned back in his chair, his smile never faltering. Those are bold words, Miss Cole, but I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play games with me, Arden said. I know it was you. Do you? Dorsey set his glass down, his expression hardening. And do you have proof? Witnesses? Anything beyond your own paranoid suspicions? Arden's jaw tightened. She didn't, and they both knew it. I didn't think so, Dorsey said. Now, if you're quite finished making a scene, I suggest you go home, before you embarrass yourself further. Arden stared at him, her hands trembling with rage. She wanted to hit him, to scream, to do something, anything, to wipe that smug smile off his face. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened, her voice ice cold. You think you've won, she said. But you haven't. And when I prove what you've done, everyone in this town is going to see you for what you really are. Dorsey's smile widened. I look forward to it. Arden turned and walked out, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. Outside, she leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. She'd meant every word, but she didn't know how she was going to make good on them. Unfit. The attacks continued. Over the next week, Arden lost another section of fence, had her water trough poisoned, and found one of her horses lamed, its leg deliberately injured. Each incident was calculated, designed to wear her down, to drain her resources, to force her into a corner. And it was working. Arden was exhausted, running on too little sleep and too much fear. Rhett and Danny did what they could, but 3 people couldn't watch an entire ranch, and whoever Dorsey had hired was good. They struck at night, in the shadows, leaving no trace beyond the damage itself. We can't keep this up, Danny said one evening, his voice shaking. We're barely holding on as it is. We don't have a choice, Arden said, though even she could hear the doubt in her voice. Yes, we do, Rhett said quietly. He'd been standing at the window, staring out into the darkness, but now he turned to face her. We take the fight to him. Arden looked up. What do you mean? Dorsey's been hitting us where we're weakest, Rhett said, but he's got weaknesses too. We just have to find them. And how do we do that? Arden asked. Rhett's smile was grim. We start asking questions, and we don't stop until we get answers. The next day, Rhett rode into town and spent hours talking to people, ranch hands, shopkeepers, drifters passing through. Most of them were too scared to say anything, but a few were willing to talk, especially after a few drinks loosened their tongues. He came back late that night, his expression dark. What did you find? Arden asked. Dorsey's been doing this for years, Rhett said, targeting small ranchers, bleeding them dry, then buying up their land for pennies on the dollar. You're just the latest. Arden's stomach twisted. Did anyone admit to working for him? Not directly, Rhett said, but I got a name. A man named Pike. He's one of Dorsey's enforcers, does his dirty work. Where is he? Arden asked. Stays at a boarding house on the edge of town, Rhett said. I'm going to pay him a visit tomorrow. We're going to pay him a visit, Arden corrected. Rhett started to argue, but the look on Arden's face stopped him. Fine, he said, but we do this smart. No guns, no fights. We just talk. Arden nodded. Just talk. They found Pike the next afternoon, sitting on the porch of the boarding house, cleaning his rifle. He was a big man, thick-shouldered and mean-looking, with a scar running down the side of his face. He looked up as they approached, and his eyes narrowed. Help you? Maybe, Rhett said casually, leaning against the porch railing. We're looking for information. I don't sell information, Pike said, going back to his rifle. We're not asking you to sell it, Arden said. We're asking you to confirm it. Pike glanced at her, his expression skeptical. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, Rhett said quietly, we're going to make your life very difficult. Pike laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You threatening me, boy? Just stating facts, Rhett said. Now. You've been working for Clayton Dorsey, haven't you? Cutting fences, starting fires, making life hell for people he wants gone. Pike's smile faded. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Arden said. And I think you're going to tell us everything. Because if you don't, we're going to the sheriff, and we're going to make sure he knows exactly what you've been doing. Pike's hand tightened on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. You got no proof. Not yet, Rhett said, but we will. And when we do, you're going to hang. Pike stared at them for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he spat into the dirt. Dorsey don't pay me enough for this, he muttered. He set the rifle down and crossed his arms. What do you want to know? Arden's heart leaped. Everything. And Pike started talking. By the time they left the boarding house, Arden had everything she needed. Pike had confessed to the fence cutting, the fire, the poisoned trough, all of it. He'd even named 2 other men who'd helped him, both of whom worked for Dorsey. It wasn't enough to bring Dorsey down in court. Pike's word alone wouldn't hold up, but it was enough to start building a case. We need to take this to the sheriff, Arden said as they rode back toward the ranch. The sheriff's in Dorsey's pocket, Rhett said. You know that. Then we go over his head, Arden said. We take it to the territorial marshal. Rhett looked at her, surprised. You think he'll listen? He will if we give him enough evidence, Arden said, and we're going to get it. For the first time in days, Arden felt a spark of hope. They weren't beaten yet, not even close. But as they rode up to the ranch, that hope flickered and died. The house was on fire. Flames roared from the windows, black smoke billowing into the sky. Danny was in the yard shouting, trying to fight the blaze with a single bucket of water. Arden didn't think. She kicked Rust into a gallop, her heart in her throat. This wasn't just an attack anymore. This was an attempt to destroy everything she had left. And she wasn't going to let it happen. Arden threw herself off Rust before the mare had even stopped moving. The heat hit her like a physical blow, fierce and relentless, the air shimmering with it. Flames consumed the front of the house, licking up the wooden walls and curling through the broken windows. The roar was deafening. "Danny!" she screamed. "Get back!" Danny stumbled away from the flames, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild. "I tried. I couldn't." "It's all right," Rhett said, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You did what you could." But it wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. Arden ran toward the side of the house where the flames hadn't yet spread. The back door was still intact, and she could see through the smoke that the kitchen hadn't caught yet. Her father's ledgers were in there, the deed to the property, everything that proved this land was hers. "Arden, no!" Rhett shouted, but she was already moving. She yanked her bandana up over her nose and mouth and plunged through the door. The smoke was thick, choking, burning her lungs with every breath. She dropped low, crawling across the floor toward the small desk where she kept the documents. The heat was unbearable. Sweat poured down her face, and her eyes stung so badly she could barely see. Her hands found the desk, and she yanked open the drawer. The ledgers were there, along with the metal box that held the deed and the receipt from the bank. She grabbed them and turned to go, and that's when she heard the crack. The beam above her head groaned, and Arden looked up just in time to see it give way. She threw herself backward, the ledgers clutched to her chest as the beam crashed down exactly where she'd been crouching. "Arden!" Rhett's voice was closer now, frantic. "I'm here," she choked out, coughing violently. The smoke was so thick she couldn't see the door anymore. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced it down. She had to get out. She had to... A hand grabbed her arm, strong and sure, and hauled her upright. Rhett's face appeared through the smoke, his eyes locked on hers. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. "Now." He pulled her toward the door, his grip never loosening, and they burst out into the yard just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. Arden fell to her knees, gasping for air, her lungs burning. Danny was there in an instant, helping her up. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Arden managed, though her voice was barely a rasp. She looked back at the house. The flames had fully engulfed it now, the structure groaning and cracking as it burned. Everything she'd grown up with, everything her father had built, it was all gone. Rhett crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You got the documents?" Arden nodded, still clutching the ledgers and the metal box to her chest. "I got them." "Good," Rhett said quietly. "Then we're not finished yet." Arden looked at him, then at the burning house, and something inside her hardened. Dorsey had taken everything he could from her, her peace, her safety, her home, but he hadn't broken her, and he never would. They spent the night in the barn, watching the house burn to the ground. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left but charred timbers and ash. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and Arden's throat was raw from breathing it. Danny had fallen asleep against a hay bale, his face still streaked with soot. Rhett sat beside Arden on an overturned crate, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the horizon. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "If Dorsey's willing to burn you out, he's willing to do worse." "I'm not leaving," Arden said. Her voice was hoarse, but there was steel in it. "This is my land, my father's land. I'm not giving it to him." "I'm not saying you should," Rhett said, "but we need to be smart about this. Right now we're sitting targets." Arden knew he was right, but the thought of leaving, even temporarily, felt like surrender. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Rhett was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We go to the territorial marshal like you said. We give him everything we've got, Pike's confession, the evidence of the attacks. We make this official." "And if the marshal doesn't listen?" Arden asked. "Then we make him listen," Rhett said, "whatever it takes." Arden looked at him, and despite everything, she felt a flicker of gratitude. She didn't know what she'd done to deserve someone like Rhett, someone who stayed when everyone else ran, who fought when fighting seemed impossible, but she was grateful for it. "All right," she said, "we leave today." The territorial marshal's office was in Carson City, a 2-day ride from Coldwater Junction. Arden, Rhett, and Danny set out just after dawn, riding hard and stopping only when the horses needed rest. Arden's mind churned the entire way. She replayed Pike's confession over and over, making sure she had every detail straight. She thought about what she would say to the marshal, how she would convince him that Dorsey was behind everything. She had to make this work. There were no second chances. They reached Carson City on the evening of the second day. It was a larger town than Coldwater Junction, with paved streets and brick buildings, and the hum of activity that came with proximity to the railroad. Arden felt out of place here, dusty and worn from the road, but she didn't let it show. The marshal's office was near the center of town, a sturdy building with a sign that read, "Territorial Marshal, John Calloway." Arden dismounted and tied Russ to the post, then walked inside with Rhett and Danny at her back. The interior was clean and organized, with a large desk at the center and several chairs along the walls. A man sat behind the desk, middle-aged, with graying hair and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. He looked up as they entered. "Help you?" he asked. "Marshal Calloway?" Arden said. "That's right. My name is Arden Cole. I own a ranch near Coldwater Junction, and I'm here to file a formal complaint against Clayton Dorsey." Calloway's eyebrows rose slightly. "Clayton Dorsey? That's a serious accusation. What's he done?" Arden set the metal box on the desk and opened it, pulling out the documents inside. "He's been waging a campaign of intimidation and sabotage against my property, fence cutting, arson, poisoning livestock. I have a witness who's willing to testify that Dorsey hired him to do it." Calloway leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "A witness? Who?" "A man named Pike," Arden said. "He works for Dorsey. He confessed to everything." "And where is this Pike now?" Calloway asked. Arden hesitated. "Still in Coldwater Junction, but he'll testify. I'm sure of it." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "You're sure of it, but you didn't bring him with you." "I didn't have time," Arden said. "My house was burned to the ground 2 days ago. I came here as soon as I could." Calloway studied her for a long moment, then picked up one of the documents she'd laid out. He scanned it, his expression unreadable. "This is a receipt from the bank," he said, "showing you paid off your loan." "That's right," Arden said. "Dorsey tried to call the loan early, but I paid it, and when that didn't work, he started burning me out." "Do you have proof that Dorsey ordered the fire?" Calloway asked. Arden's stomach sank. "Not direct proof, but Pike confessed to the earlier attacks, and—" "But you don't have Pike here to testify," Calloway interrupted. "And you don't have proof connecting Dorsey to the fire." He set the receipt down. "Miss Cole, I understand you're upset, and if what you're saying is true, it's a serious matter. But without solid evidence, there's not much I can do." "What about Pike's confession?" Rhett said, stepping forward. "That's evidence." "Hearsay," Calloway said. "Unless he testifies in front of a judge, it's just your word against Dorsey's. And Dorsey's a well-respected man in this territory." Arden felt her hands clench into fists. "So that's it? You're just going to let him get away with this?" I'm not letting anyone get away with anything, Calloway said, his tone firm. But the law requires evidence, Miss Cole. If you want me to act, you need to bring me something concrete. Witnesses, documents, physical proof. Right now, all you've got is a story. Arden stared at him, her chest tight with frustration and despair. She'd ridden 2 days, risked everything, and it still wasn't enough. Come back when you've got more, Calloway said, not unkindly. Until then, my hands are tied. Moss. They left the marshal's office in silence. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Arden stood on the boardwalk, staring at nothing, her mind spinning. He's right, she said finally. We need more. Then we'll get more, Rhett said. We go back to Coldwater Junction. We find Pike and bring him here. We make him testify. And if he refuses? Arden asked. He won't, Rhett said. Not if we make it clear what's at stake. Arden looked at him, then at Danny, who nodded silently. They were with her, no matter what. All right, she said. We go back. They rode through the night, pushing the horses harder than they should have. By the time they reached Coldwater Junction, it was mid-morning, and the town was buzzing with activity. Arden rode straight to the boarding house where Pike had been staying, but when she knocked on his door, there was no answer. He's gone, the landlady said, appearing behind them. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a skeptical expression. Left 2 days ago, packed up his things and rode out without paying what he owed. Arden's heart sank. Did he say where he was going? Didn't say a word, the landlady said, but I saw him talking to Mr. Dorsey the night before. Looked like they were having a heated conversation. Arden exchanged a glance with Rhett. Dorsey had gotten to Pike. He'd either paid him off or threatened him into leaving. Damn it, Arden muttered. What now? Danny asked quietly. Arden didn't answer right away. Her mind was racing, searching for another angle, another way to get the proof they needed. And then it hit her. The other 2 men, she said, turning to Rhett. Pike said there were 2 others who helped him. If we can find them, maybe they'll talk. It's a long shot, Rhett said. It's all we've got, Arden replied. Tame. It took them the rest of the day to track down the first man, a drifter named Clem who'd been staying at a camp outside of town. They found him sitting by a fire, cooking a rabbit on a spit. He looked up as they approached, his eyes wary. I don't want any trouble. Then don't give us any, Rhett said. We just want to talk. Clem's gaze flicked to Arden, then back to Rhett. About what? About Clayton Dorsey, Arden said, and the work he's been paying you to do. Clem's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Arden said. Pike already told us everything. We know you helped him cut fences and poison livestock. We just need you to confirm it. Clem laughed bitterly. You think I'm going to testify against Dorsey? You think I'm that stupid? I think you're smart enough to know that if you don't, you're going to hang alongside him, Rhett said. The marshal's already building a case. You cooperate now, you might get a lighter sentence. You don't, and you'll swing with the rest of them. Clem's smile faded. He stared at them for a long moment, then shook his head. I ain't saying nothing, and if you're smart, you'll drop this before Dorsey drops you. He turned his back on them, and Arden knew they weren't going to get anything out of him. Come on, Rhett said quietly. Let's go, Chud. They had no better luck with the second man. He'd disappeared entirely, and no one in town knew where he'd gone. By the time they returned to what was left of the ranch, Arden was exhausted, frustrated. They had nothing, no witnesses, no proof, no way to bring Dorsey down. She sat on the porch steps of the barn, staring at the ruins of the house, and felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her. Rhett sat down beside her, silent for a long moment. We're not giving up, he said finally. I know, Arden said quietly, but I don't know what else to do. Rhett was quiet, thinking. Then he said, There's one more option. Arden looked at him. What? We force Dorsey's hand, Rhett said. We make him come after us in a way that can't be hidden, in front of witnesses. How? Arden asked. Rhett's expression was grim. We rebuild. Right here, right now. We make it clear we're not leaving, and we dare him to try to stop us. Arden stared at him. That's insane. He'll just burn it down again.
Maybe, Rhett said, but this time we'll be ready. And this time we'll have witnesses. People from town, people he can't intimidate or pay off. We make this public. Arden's mind raced. It was risky, maybe suicidal, but it was also the only play they had left. All right, she said, let's do it.
What? The next morning, Arden rode into town and stood in the middle of the main street. People stopped and stared as she raised her voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm rebuilding my ranch, she said, starting today. And I'm asking anyone who believes in fairness and justice to come help me. There was a long silence. People exchanged glances, uncertain. Then, slowly, a man stepped forward. It was Mr. Brennan, the shopkeeper. I'll help, he said quietly. Another man joined him, then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Not everyone, but enough. Arden felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, she said. As they rode back to the ranch, Rhett looked at her and smiled. You did it. We did it, Arden corrected. But as they began the work of rebuilding, Arden couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still to come. And she was right. 3 days later, as the frame of the new house began to take shape, riders appeared on the horizon, Clayton Dorsey, and a dozen armed men. Arden's heart pounded as she reached for her rifle. Beside her, Rhett did the same. Here we go, he said quietly. Dorsey rode up slowly, his men flanking him. He looked at the construction, at the people working, and his expression darkened. You don't know when to quit, do you? He said. No, Arden said. I don't. Dorsey's hand moved toward his gun, and that's when the sound of hooves filled the air. Marshal Calloway rode into the yard, flanked by 2 deputies. His eyes swept the scene, taking everything in. Nobody moves, he said, his voice carrying authority. Dorsey's hand froze. Marshal, this is a private matter. Not anymore, Calloway said. He looked at Arden. Miss Cole sent me a letter, detailed everything. I've been watching you, Dorsey, and I've got enough now to bring you in. Dorsey's face went white. You've got nothing. I've got witnesses, Calloway said. People who saw your men riding out here. People willing to testify. He nodded toward the crowd of townspeople. And I've got you, right here, about to commit another crime in front of all of them. Dorsey stared at him, his jaw working. Then slowly he raised his hands. Take him, Calloway said. As the deputies moved forward, Arden felt something inside her break open. Not despair, but relief. It was over. She'd won. The deputies moved forward with deliberate precision, their hands on their weapons as they approached Dorsey. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The townspeople who'd come to help rebuild stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Even the wind seemed to still, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Dorsey's face had gone from white to red, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. His men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near their guns, but none of them moved. They were hired hands, not killers, and facing down a territorial marshal was a different matter entirely from intimidating a woman alone. This is a mistake, Marshal, Dorsey said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I'm a respected businessman in this territory. You can't just... I can, and I am, Calloway interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and intimidation. You'll have your day in court, but right now, you're coming with me. One of the deputies moved to bind Dorsey's hands, but Dorsey jerked away. Get your hands off me. I haven't done anything wrong. These are nothing but baseless accusations from a desperate woman who can't accept that she's failed. Arden stepped forward, her rifle still in her hands but pointed at the ground. Failed? Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath it. I'm still standing, Dorsey. My ranch is still mine, and now everyone knows exactly what you are. Dorsey's eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, the hatred there was so pure, so visceral, that Arden almost took a step back. But she didn't. She held his gaze, unflinching. You think this is over? Dorsey said quietly, his voice dropping so that only those closest could hear. You think arresting me changes anything? I own half this territory. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. You've just made the worst enemy of your life. No, Arden said. You already were my worst enemy. The difference now is that everyone else knows it too. The deputy moved in again, and this time Dorsey didn't resist. As they bound his wrists, Calloway turned to address Dorsey's men. The rest of you can go, he said, but if I find out any of you were involved in the attacks on Miss Cole's property, I'll be coming for you next. Understood? The men nodded quickly, turning their horses and riding off without a word. They knew when a fight was lost. As Calloway and his deputies led Dorsey away, the man twisted in his saddle to look back at Arden one last time. This isn't finished, he said. Yes, Arden replied quietly. It is. She watched until they disappeared down the road, and only then did she allow herself to lower the rifle. Her hands were shaking, she realized. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything that had just happened. Rhett was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. You all right? Arden nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Around them, the townspeople began to stir, murmuring among themselves. Mr. Brennan was the first to approach, his weathered face creased with something that might have been respect. That was brave, Miss Cole, he said. What you did, standing up to him like that. I didn't have a choice, Arden said. We all have choices, Brennan replied. You just made the hard ones. He paused, then added, I'm sorry I didn't help you sooner. I should have. Arden looked at him, then at the others who'd come to help rebuild. You're here now, she said. That's what matters. One by one, the townspeople returned to work, and slowly, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air again. It was a strange feeling, watching strangers work to rebuild what Dorsey had destroyed. Strange, but good. Danny appeared at her side, grinning despite the dirt and sweat on his face. Did you see the look on his face when the marshal showed up? I thought he was going to fall right off his horse. Arden couldn't help but smile. I saw it. We did it, Danny said, his voice filled with wonder. We actually did it. We're not done yet, Rhett said, but there was warmth in his voice. We've still got a house to build. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of constant work. The frame of the new house went up quickly with so many hands helping, and slowly it began to take shape. It wasn't as large as the old house. Arden couldn't afford that. But it was solid, built to last, with strong timber and a stone foundation that would withstand anything the territory could throw at it. Word of Dorsey's arrest spread through the region like wildfire, and with it came a shift in the way people treated Arden. The whispers that had followed her everywhere began to change. Where once they'd spoken of her with pity or disdain, now they spoke with a kind of cautious respect. She was the woman who'd stood up to Clayton Dorsey and won. Not everyone was happy about it. Some of Dorsey's friends and business associates made it clear they considered Arden a troublemaker, someone who'd upset the natural order of things. But they kept their distance, wary of drawing the marshal's attention. The trial was set for 6 weeks after Dorsey's arrest, to be held in Carson City. Arden knew she'd have to testify, to stand up in front of a judge in a courtroom full of people and tell her story. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety, but she pushed it aside. She'd faced worse than a courtroom. In the meantime, she focused on the ranch. The cattle that had survived were thriving on the autumn grass, growing fat and healthy. The fences had been fully repaired, stronger than before, and the new house was nearly complete, just waiting for the roof to be finished and the windows installed. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Arden stood on what would soon be the front porch of her new home, looking out over the land. Rhett joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed one to her without a word. Thank you, Arden said, taking it. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the sky change colors. I've been thinking, Rhett said finally. About what? Arden asked. About what happens after the trial, Rhett said. Assuming Dorsey's convicted, and he will be. What then? You going to keep running this place alone? Arden looked at him, trying to read his expression in the fading light. I won't be alone. I've got Danny, and I can hire more help now that the debt's paid off. That's not what I meant, Rhett said quietly. Arden's heart began to beat a little faster. Then what did you mean? Rhett set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned to face her fully. I mean, I'm not leaving Arden, not unless you tell me to. I wouldn't do that, Arden said quickly. I know, Rhett said, but I need to know what this is, what we are. Because somewhere between chasing cattle and fighting Dorsey, this stopped being just a job for me. Arden felt her throat tighten. She'd known, on some level, that things between them had changed, that the bond they'd formed over the past months was deeper than simple partnership. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I don't know what we are, she admitted, but I know I don't want you to leave. Rhett stepped closer, and his hand found hers. Then I'm staying, for as long as you'll have me. Arden looked up at him, and in his eyes, she saw everything she'd been too afraid to hope for. Trust, loyalty, something that might become love if they gave it time. Forever might be a long time, she said softly. Rhett's smile was slow and warm. Good thing I'm patient. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and unhurried, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Arden felt truly at peace. The trial began on a crisp October morning. The courthouse in Carson City was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Arden had never seen so many people in one place, and the weight of their collective stares made her skin prickle with nervousness. Marshal Calloway had done his job well. In the weeks since Dorsey's arrest, he'd tracked down witnesses, gathered evidence, and built a case that even Dorsey's expensive lawyers couldn't easily dismiss. Pike had been found 2 territories over and brought back to testify, along with Clem and the second man, both of whom had been offered reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Arden sat in the front row, Rhett beside her, his presence a steadying force. On the other side of the aisle, Dorsey sat with his lawyers, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the hatred radiating off him like heat from a fire. The judge was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through anyone who stood before him. His name was Judge Whitman, and he had a reputation for being fair but unforgiving. The prosecution went first, laying out the case against Dorsey with methodical precision. They called Pike to the stand, and he testified about everything: the fence cutting, the poisoned water, the fires. He named Dorsey as the one who'd paid him, who'd given him the orders. Dorsey's lawyers tried to discredit Pike, painting him as a criminal whose word couldn't be trusted. But when Clem and the other man testified to the same story, corroborating every detail, the defense began to crumble. Then it was Arden's turn. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out beneath her, but she kept her head high. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Garrison, and she began with gentle questions, establishing the timeline of events and Arden's relationship to the property. Miss Cole, Mrs. Garrison said, can you describe the condition of your ranch before Mr. Dorsey began his campaign against you? It was struggling, Arden admitted. My father had taken out a loan before he died, and I was trying to pay it off. But it was mine, and I was managing. And after Mr. Dorsey called in the loan early? Everything changed, Arden said. Suddenly, I couldn't get credit anywhere. People who'd been friendly before wouldn't talk to me. And then the attacks started. What kind of attacks? Mrs. Garrison asked. Arden took a deep breath and laid it all out. The broken fences, the poisoned trough, the hayshed fire, the house burning to the ground. As she spoke, she could see the jury's expressions shifting from skepticism to shock to anger. And you believe Mr. Dorsey was behind all of this? Mrs. Garrison asked. I know he was, Arden said firmly. He wanted my land, and when I wouldn't sell, he tried to destroy me. Dorsey's lawyer stood to cross-examine her, a slick man in an expensive suit who smiled like a snake. Miss Cole, he said smoothly, isn't it true that you were deeply in debt? That your ranch was failing? I was in debt, Arden said, but I wasn't failing. I paid off that debt in full. By gambling, the lawyer said. You took a risky cattle drive to Silver Creek and sold your herd. That's hardly the action of a responsible rancher. It was the action of someone fighting for her life, Arden shot back. And it worked. The lawyer's smile thinned. You claim Mr. Dorsey orchestrated these attacks, but you have no direct evidence linking him to them, do you? I have the testimony of the men he hired, Arden said. Men who are criminals, the lawyer countered. Men who would say anything to save themselves. Men who told the truth, Arden said. And you know it, and you. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Whitman cut him off. That's enough. Move on, counselor. The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, but Arden held her ground. She didn't waver, didn't let the lawyer's insinuations shake her, and when she finally stepped down from the stand, she could see in the jury's faces that they believed her. The trial lasted 3 more days. The defense called character witnesses for Dorsey, men who spoke of his philanthropy and business acumen, but none of it could erase the mountain of evidence against him. On the 4th day, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. We find the defendant, Clayton Dorsey, guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, murmurs, a few scattered cheers. Arden felt her knees go weak with relief, and Rhett's hand found hers, squeezing tightly. Judge Whitman banged his gavel, calling for order. When the room quieted, he looked at Dorsey with an expression of cold disdain. Mr. Dorsey, he said, you used your wealth and influence to terrorize an innocent woman and destroy her property. You acted not as a businessman but as a tyrant. The sentence of this court is 10 years in the territorial prison, and restitution to be paid to Miss Cole in the amount of $5,000 for damages. Dorsey's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the judge cut him off. Bailiff, remove the prisoner. As Dorsey was led away in chains, he looked at Arden one last time, but this time there was no hatred in his eyes, only defeat. The ride back to Coldwater Junction felt different, lighter. The weight that had pressed down on Arden for so long was finally gone, and she felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in months. When they arrived at the ranch, the new house was finished. The workers had completed the roof and installed the windows in her absence, and it stood proud and strong against the autumn sky. Danny was waiting for them in the yard, grinning from ear to ear. Did you hear? The whole town's talking about it. Dorsey's finished. We heard, Arden said, smiling. We were there. Danny whooped and threw his hat in the air, and despite herself, Arden laughed. It felt good to laugh. It felt like freedom. Over the next few weeks, the restitution money came through, and Arden used it to buy more cattle, hire additional hands, and make improvements to the ranch that she'd only dreamed of before. The property began to thrive in a way it never had under her father, and word spread that Arden Cole ran one of the best operations in the territory. People who'd once shunned her now sought her advice. Ranchers came from neighboring counties to ask how she managed her herd, how she'd survived when so many others had failed. And Arden answered their questions with patience and grace, never once mentioning the hell she'd gone through to get there. Winter came, blanketing the land in snow, and with it came a quiet kind of peace. Arden and Rhett worked side by side, building a life together that was equal parts partnership and love. They never officially married. Neither of them saw the need for a piece of paper to validate what they already knew. But everyone in town understood that they were a unit, inseparable and unshakable. Danny grew into his role on the ranch, becoming one of the most skilled hands Arden had ever seen. He was fiercely loyal, and Arden came to think of him less as an employee and more as the younger brother she'd never had. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside, Arden sat by the fire in her new house, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of tea warming her hands. Rhett sat beside her, reading a book he'd picked up in town, and Danny was in the kitchen, humming tunelessly as he cooked dinner. It was such a simple scene, so ordinary, and yet it meant everything. You ever think about how different things could have been? Rhett asked, looking up from his book. Arden considered the question. Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. Why not? Rhett asked. Because dwelling on what could have been means missing what is, Arden said. And what is? It's pretty damn good. Rhett smiled and set his book aside. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Yeah, he said quietly, it is. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white. But inside, the fire burned warm and bright, and Arden knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she was finally home. Spring came, as it always did, bringing with it new life and new challenges. Arden's herd had grown significantly over the winter, and she found herself in the enviable position of needing to hire more help just to keep up with the work. The town's attitude toward her had shifted completely. Where once she'd been an outsider, a source of gossip and speculation, now she was respected, even admired. The women who'd once whispered about her behind closed doors now greeted her warmly on the street. The men who'd refused to work for her now asked if she had any positions available. It was a strange feeling being accepted after so long on the outside. But Arden didn't let it change who she was. She remained the same hard-working, no-nonsense woman she'd always been, just with a little more confidence and a lot less fear. One afternoon in early April, as Arden was working in the barn, a rider approached. She looked up to see Marshal Calloway dismounting, a letter in his hand. "Marshal," Arden said, setting down the brush she'd been using to groom one of the horses. "What brings you out here?" "Thought you'd want to know," Calloway said, handing her the letter. "Dorsey's been transferred to a work camp up north. He'll be breaking rocks for the next decade." Arden took the letter but didn't open it. "Good," she said simply. Calloway studied her for a moment. "You know, Miss Cole, what you did, standing up to him the way you did, it's inspired a lot of people. I've had 3 other ranchers come to me in the past month with complaints about similar intimidation tactics. They said if you could fight back, so could they." Arden felt something warm bloom in her chest. "I'm glad," she said. "No one should have to go through what I did." "No," Calloway agreed. "They shouldn't." He tipped his hat. "Take care of yourself, Miss Cole. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." "Thank you, Marshal," Arden said. As Calloway rode away, Rhett emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a rag. "What did he want?" "Just an update on Dorsey," Arden said. She tucked the letter into her pocket, unread. "He's gone. For good." Rhett nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Then it's really over." "Yeah," Arden said. "It really is." Cat. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and long days. The ranch was busier than it had ever been, with new calves being born, fences needing mending, and 1,000 other tasks that filled every waking hour. But Arden thrived on the work, and so did everyone around her. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of red and orange, Arden stood on the porch of her house. Her house, the one she'd built with her own 2 hands and the help of people who'd come to believe in her, and looked out over the land. Rhett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about how far we've come," Arden said. "A year ago, I was about to lose everything. And now you own one of the most successful ranches in the territory," Rhett finished. "And you've got a man who's hopelessly in love with you." Arden turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "Hopelessly?" "Completely," Rhett said, his voice soft. "I know we said we didn't need to make it official, but I'd like to, if you would." Arden felt her heart swell. "Are you asking me to marry you, Rhett Maddox?" "I am," Rhett said. "What do you say?" Arden pretended to think about it, then smiled. "I say yes." Rhett's grin was bright enough to rival the setting sun, and he kissed her with a fierceness that took her breath away. They were married a month later, in a small ceremony on the ranch with Danny as the witness and half the town in attendance. It wasn't fancy. Arden wore a simple dress, and Rhett wore his best shirt, but it was theirs, and that was all that mattered. As they stood together, hands clasped, promising to face whatever the future held side by side, Arden felt a sense of completeness she'd never known before. She'd fought for this life, bled for it, nearly died for it. And now, finally, it was hers. Years passed, measured not in grand events but in quiet moments. The ranch continued to grow, becoming one of the most prosperous in the territory. Arden and Rhett built a life together that was equal parts love and partnership, weathering droughts and harsh winters and the endless challenges that came with ranching. Danny eventually met a girl in town, a schoolteacher named Sarah, and they married and built a small house on the eastern edge of Arden's property. He continued to work the ranch, now as Arden's partner rather than just a hired hand, and together they expanded the operation even further. Other women in the territory began to follow Arden's example, running their own ranches, making their own decisions, refusing to be pushed aside by men who thought they knew better. And when they needed advice or support, they came to Arden, who welcomed them with open arms and shared everything she'd learned. The town of Coldwater Junction changed too. The old guard, men like Dorsey, who'd ruled through fear and intimidation, gradually faded away, replaced by a new generation that valued fairness and hard work over wealth and connections. And through it all, Arden remained true to herself. She never forgot where she'd come from, never took for granted the life she'd built. She knew how easily it could all be taken away, and that knowledge made her appreciate every sunrise, every good season, every moment of peace. One evening, many years after Dorsey's trial, Arden sat on the porch of her house with Rhett beside her. Their hair was touched with gray now, their hands weathered from decades of work, but their love had only deepened with time. "You ever regret it?" Rhett asked. "Fighting so hard for this place?" Arden looked out over the land, watching the sun set over the hills she knew like the back of her hand. She thought about everything she'd endured, everything she'd sacrificed, and everything she'd gained. "Not for a second," she said. Rhett squeezed her hand. "Good, because I don't either." They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. But Arden wasn't afraid. She never was anymore. She'd learned long ago that the ones who don't fit the mold are the ones who break it. And in breaking it, they create something new, something better, something worth fighting for. And that legacy, built on courage, defiance, and an unshakable belief in her own worth, would endure long after she was gone. The deputies moved forward with their shackles, and Dorsey's men scattered like leaves in a storm, unwilling to face the law for a man who'd just been exposed. As the metal clicked around Dorsey's wrists, Arden felt something shift deep inside her chest. Not triumph exactly, but something quieter. Relief. Vindication. The knowledge that justice, however hard fought, was still possible. Dorsey turned his head as the deputies led him toward their horses, his eyes finding Arden one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but all you've done is make yourself a target. There are others like me, men with power. They won't forget this." "Good," Arden said, her voice steady. "Let them remember what happens when they try to destroy someone who refuses to break." Calloway swung into his saddle, one hand on the reins of the horse carrying Dorsey. "Miss Cole, I'll need you to come to Carson City next week to give a formal statement. Bring any documentation you have, the receipt from the bank, Pike's confession, anything that supports your case." "I'll be there," Arden said. The marshal tipped his hat. "You did good work here. Most people would have given up long before it got to this point." His eyes flicked to Rhett, then back to Arden. "You've got good people around you. Don't forget that." "I won't," Arden promised. As the marshal and his deputies rode off with Dorsey bound between them, the crowd of townspeople erupted into conversation. Some looked shocked, others satisfied, and a few, those who'd been allied with Dorsey, wore expressions of barely concealed fury. But Arden didn't care about their anger. They couldn't touch her now. Rhett stepped close, his hand finding the small of her back. "You all right?" Arden exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders for the first time in months. "Yeah, I think I am." Danny appeared at her other side, his young face split by a wide grin. "We did it. We actually did it." "We did," Arden agreed, and she reached out to squeeze his shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without you, kid." Danny flushed with pride, and Arden felt a surge of affection for this boy who'd stuck by her when no one else would. Mr. Brennan approached, his hat in his hands. "Miss Cole, I just want to say, we should have helped you sooner. A lot of us knew what Dorsey was doing, but we were too scared to stand up to him." He looked down at his boots. "That was cowardly." "You're here now," Arden said. "That's what matters." Brennan looked up, his eyes grateful. "We'll finish your house. Every man here will work until it's done, and we won't take a cent for it. It's the least we can do." Arden felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the crowd dispersed back to their work, Arden stood in the yard of her half-built home and looked around. The frame was solid, the walls beginning to take shape. In a few weeks, maybe less, she'd have a roof over her head again. A home that no one could burn down, no one could take away. Rhett pulled her close, and she leaned into him, letting herself rest for just a moment. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now?" Arden looked up at him. "Now we build." The trial took place 3 weeks later in Carson City, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to see the downfall of a man who'd wielded power like a weapon for too long. Arden sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the one good dress she owned, a dark blue cotton that had belonged to her mother. Rhett sat beside her, and Danny was just behind them, his presence a quiet comfort. Dorsey entered in chains, flanked by 2 guards, and the room went silent. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he'd seemed on horseback, with his hired guns behind him. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his eyes. The judge was a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret Holloway, known throughout the territory for her sharp mind and unwillingness to tolerate nonsense. She looked down at Dorsey with the same expression she might give a particularly unpleasant insect. "Mr. Dorsey," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room, "you stand accused of conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, extortion, and attempted fraud. How do you plead?" Dorsey's lawyer, a slick man from Denver, stood quickly. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My client is a respected businessman who—" "I didn't ask you," Judge Holloway interrupted. "I asked your client." Dorsey's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "Not guilty. Very well." The judge turned to the prosecution. "Present your case." The prosecutor was a young man named Thomas Wright, who'd made his reputation going after corrupt land speculators. He stood and began laying out the evidence methodically. Pike's testimony, the statements from the 2 other men who'd confessed, the timeline of attacks on Arden's property, and the financial records showing Dorsey had been systematically acquiring land from struggling ranchers for years. When it was time for witnesses, Pike was called first. He walked to the stand with his head down, refusing to look at Dorsey. Under Wright's questioning, he laid out everything: how Dorsey had approached him in a saloon, offered him good money to make life difficult for a woman running a ranch alone; how he'd cut fences and poisoned water and finally set fire to the hay shed. "And did Mr. Dorsey ever explicitly tell you to burn down Miss Cole's house?" Wright asked. Pike hesitated. "Not in so many words. But after the hay shed, he said I needed to do something that would make her leave for good, something she couldn't recover from." "And you interpreted that to mean burning her house?" "Yes, sir." Dorsey's lawyer tried to tear Pike apart on cross-examination, painting him as a criminal looking for a reduced sentence. But Pike held firm. When the other 2 men testified to the same pattern of behavior, the defense began to crumble. Then Arden was called to the stand. She walked up with her back straight, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As she settled into the chair, she could feel every eye in the room on her, but she kept her gaze on the prosecutor. Wright began with basic questions: how long she'd owned the ranch, what condition it had been in, how she'd discovered the debt. Then he moved to the attacks. "Miss Cole, can you describe what happened the night your house burned down?" Arden took a breath. "I'd been in town with Rhett, Mr. Maddox, trying to find witnesses. When we got back to the ranch, the house was already engulfed. Danny, our hired hand, had tried to fight it, but there were too many flames." She paused. "I went inside to save my father's papers, the deed to the land, the receipt showing I'd paid off the loan. I barely made it out." "Why were those papers so important?" "Because without them, I had no proof the ranch was mine," Arden said simply. "Dorsey had been trying to destroy me financially for months. I knew if I lost those documents, he'd find a way to take everything." Wright nodded. "And do you believe Mr. Dorsey ordered that fire?" "I know he did," Arden said, her voice firm. "He'd already tried everything else. This was his final play." Dorsey's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his smile practiced and cold. "Miss Cole, isn't it true that you were deeply in debt when your father died?" "Yes." "And that you were struggling to make ends meet?" "Yes." "And that you made several risky decisions, including driving your cattle over 100 miles through dangerous terrain in order to raise money?" "I did what I had to do to save my ranch," Arden said. That's not a crime. Perhaps not, the lawyer said smoothly, but it does suggest a pattern of desperation. Isn't it possible that you're simply looking for someone to blame for your own poor choices? Arden's eyes went hard. My choices saved my ranch. Dorsey's choices destroyed property, endangered lives, and broke the law. If you can't see the difference, that's on you. A ripple of approval went through the gallery, and the judge had to bang her gavel for quiet. Dorsey's lawyer tried a few more questions, but Arden didn't waver. When she stepped down, she could see in the jury's faces that they believed her. The trial lasted 2 more days. Dorsey's defense called character witnesses, businessmen who spoke of his philanthropy, his investments in the community. But none of it could stand against the mountain of evidence Wright had assembled. When the jury retired to deliberate, Arden sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Rhett and Danny, waiting. Minutes stretched into hours. Rhett held her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her palm. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we'll deal with it. I know, Arden said, but her stomach was in knots. After 3 hours, the bailiff emerged. Jury's back. They filed back into the courtroom, and Arden's heart hammered as the jury foreman stood. In the matter of the territory versus Clayton Dorsey, on the charge of conspiracy to commit arson, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, guilty. On the charge of extortion, guilty. On the charge of attempted fraud, guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered, some shouted, and Dorsey's face went white as chalk. Arden felt Rhett's arm around her shoulders, felt Danny's hand on her back, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Judge Holloway banged her gavel until the room quieted. Mr. Dorsey, you have used your wealth and position to terrorize honest people trying to make a living. You have shown no remorse and no regard for the law. The sentence of this court is 10 years of hard labor at the territorial prison, and you will pay restitution to Miss Cole in the amount of $7,000 for damages and lost income. Dorsey's knees buckled, and the guards had to hold him upright. As they led him away, he didn't look at Arden. He couldn't. Outside the courthouse, Arden stood in the afternoon sun and let the reality of it sink in. It was over, truly over. $7,000, Danny breathed. That's enough to rebuild properly, Arden finished, to hire more hands, to finally make this ranch everything it should be. Rhett was grinning. You did it. You beat him. We did it, Arden corrected. All of us. The money came through 6 weeks later, delivered by a bank courier who looked faintly uncomfortable handing over such a sum to a woman. Arden signed for it, deposited most of it in the bank in Carson City, a different bank, one with no ties to Dorsey, and used the rest to purchase lumber, supplies, and livestock. By the time winter arrived, the new house was complete. It was larger than the old one, with a stone fireplace, real glass windows, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Arden stood in the doorway on the first night, looking at the furniture they'd built and the curtains she'd sewn, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. It's beautiful, Rhett said from behind her. It's home, Arden replied. That winter was hard. Blizzards came early and stayed late, but the ranch weathered it. The new barn kept the livestock safe, the house stayed warm, and for the first time since her father's death, Arden felt secure. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Word had spread about her victory over Dorsey, and several neighboring ranchers reached out to ask for advice. A few even offered to go into business together, pooling resources for shared grazing land and collective cattle drives. Arden considered each offer carefully and accepted the ones that made sense. Within a year, she was part of a cooperative that included 5 other ranchers, all of them working together to negotiate better prices and share the costs of infrastructure. The town's attitude toward her had transformed completely. Where once she'd been an outsider, now she was respected. Women came to her for advice on running their own businesses. Men tipped their hats when she rode down Main Street. Even Mrs. Halloway, who'd gossiped so cruelly, now invited Arden to join the church social committee. Arden politely declined. She had work to do. But one evening, as she and Rhett sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to her with a serious expression. I've been thinking, he said. About what? Arden asked. About us. About what comes next. He took her hand. We've been through hell together, and I can't imagine facing another day without you beside me. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Arden felt her heart swell. She'd known for months that what she felt for Rhett was more than partnership, more than friendship. It was love, pure and simple, the kind that lasted. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'll marry you. Rhett's smile was brighter than the setting sun. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Arden felt the last piece of her broken world fall into place. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Danny as the witness and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Arden wore a dress she'd made herself from cream-colored linen, and Rhett wore his best shirt and a string tie. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. As they stood together under the sprawling oak tree near the house, hands clasped and eyes locked, Arden felt a sense of completeness she'd never known. This man had chosen her when no one else would. He'd fought for her, bled for her, stood by her through the worst storm of her life. And now they would build something together, something that would last. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch thrived under their joint leadership, growing from a struggling operation into one of the most successful in the territory. Arden and Rhett made decisions together, respected each other's judgment, and built a partnership based on trust and love. Danny stayed on, eventually marrying a girl from town named Clara and building a small house on the eastern edge of the property. He became Arden's foreman, running the day-to-day operations while she focused on the bigger picture, negotiating contracts, managing finances, expanding their holdings. Other women in the territory began to follow Arden's example. Widows who'd been told to sell started fighting to keep their land. Young women rejected the notion that they needed husbands to manage property and struck out on their own. And when they needed advice or support, they came to Arden, who welcomed them and shared everything she'd learned. One afternoon, 5 years after Dorsey's trial, a young woman rode up to the ranch looking nervous and determined. Her name was Ellen, and she'd inherited a small plot of land from her uncle. The local banker was pressuring her to sell, claiming she couldn't manage it alone. Arden invited her in, poured her coffee, and listened to her story. "They're using the same tactics Dorsey used on you," Ellen said, her hands trembling around the cup. "Cutting me off from credit, spreading rumors that I'm incompetent. I don't know what to do." Arden leaned forward. "First, you document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every incident. Second, you find allies, people who'll stand with you when things get tough. Third, you don't quit. No matter how hard they push, you push back harder." Ellen's eyes were wide. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," Arden said. "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But it's worth it." She paused. "And you're not alone. I'll help you. So will the other women in the cooperative. We take care of our own." Ellen's face flooded with relief, and Arden saw in her the same fear and determination she'd once felt. She made a silent promise to herself that this young woman wouldn't have to fight alone the way she had. Over the next few months, Arden worked with Ellen to stabilize her operation, connecting her with honest suppliers, helping her negotiate fair terms with the bank, and teaching her everything she'd learned about ranching. By the end of the year, Ellen's small ranch was profitable, and the banker who'd tried to intimidate her had moved on to easier targets. Word spread. More women came, and slowly, the landscape of the territory began to change. 10 years after Dorsey's conviction, Arden stood on the porch of her home, a home she'd built with her own hands, defended with her own will, and looked out over land that stretched as far as the eye could see. The ranch had grown to encompass over 5,000 acres, supporting hundreds of head of cattle and employing a dozen hands year-round. But more than that, it had become a symbol, a reminder that power wasn't something given. It was something taken, held, and defended. Rhett came out to join her, moving a little slower now, his hair touched with silver at the temples. He wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Arden said. "Where we started, where we are now, how far we've come." "Any regrets?" Rhett asked. Arden considered the question seriously. She thought about the fear, the exhaustion, the moments when she'd been certain she would lose everything. She thought about the scars, physical and emotional, that she still carried. "No," she said finally. "Not a single one." Rhett kissed the top of her head. "Good, because I don't have any either. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. The wind carried the scent of grass and earth and possibility. Danny rode up the path with Clara beside him, their young daughter perched in front of him on the saddle. The little girl waved, and Arden waved back, smiling. This was her legacy. Not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, but the people. The lives she'd touched, the women she'd inspired, the community she'd helped build. Years later, when Arden was old and gray, sitting in the same chair on the same porch, a young reporter from back east came to interview her. He was writing a story about women who'd shaped the territory, and Arden's name was at the top of his list. "What would you say to young women today who are facing impossible odds?" he asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. Arden thought for a long moment, looking out over the land that had tested her, broken her, and ultimately made her stronger. "I'd tell them that impossible is just another word for difficult," she said. "And difficult just means you'll have to work harder than you ever thought possible. But if you do, if you refuse to quit, refuse to break, refuse to let anyone tell you what you're capable of, then you'll discover something." "What's that?" the reporter asked. Arden smiled. "That you're stronger than you ever imagined, and that strength, once found, can never be taken away." The reporter wrote her words down carefully, and when the article was published months later, it traveled across the country. Women read it in farmhouses and tenements, in small towns and big cities. They read about Arden Cole, the woman who'd stood alone against a corrupt system and won, the woman who'd refused to be broken. And some of them, the ones who were facing their own impossible odds, read those words and found the courage to keep fighting. Arden never read the article. She didn't need to. She knew her story, lived it every day in the land beneath her feet and the sky above her head. She knew it in the calluses on her hands and the strength in her spine. She knew it in the life she'd built with Rhett, in the community she'd helped shape, in the legacy she'd leave behind. And when she finally died, many years later, surrounded by family and friends in the home she'd fought so hard to keep, her last thought was one of satisfaction. She had lived on her own terms. She had fought for what was hers. She had refused to break. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The ranch continued for generations after her death, passed down through Danny's line and then to others who understood what it represented. The original house still stood, carefully preserved, a testament to the woman who'd built it from ashes and determination. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the grasslands, some people swore they could still feel her presence. Strong, unbreakable, eternal. A reminder that those who refuse to fit the mold are the ones who reshape the world.